When I was researching Psychedelics Season 1 back at Gaia, I came across one of my favorite researchers. His name is Chris Bennett, and he focuses solely on cannabis and its history, its influence in many of these ancient religions that you would have no clue had something to do with cannabis. But he is so meticulous in his research that he shows archaeological evidence, he shows original text manuscripts, he shows breaking archaeology that's just within the past 40, 50 years, and he also goes so deep to show connections between research that most of us just will not have done to find that cannabis has influenced humanity more than just about any other plant. In his first book, Sex, Drugs, Violence, and the Bible, he shows that cannabis or cannabosum plays heavily into the Bible and also in the origins of Christianity. But he doesn't stop there. All the way back to the legends of Soma in ancient India, in ancient China, ancient Persia with Haoma, as well as the old world of Europe. He goes super deep to show the origin of a lot of religions have their root with cannabis. And then his latest book, he comes forward in time for Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult. People like Shakespeare, Sir John Dee, and many other people that you will have heard of, but maybe had no clue had anything to do with cannabis, are in that book to an amazing degree of detail. So I'm super excited to bring you guys Chris Bennett, coming up now on the Ben Stewart podcast. Hey, how did I shave and put on a different shirt so quickly? Thanks everyone for joining me. These intros, I do them ahead of time, but I just have to say I still have all these books. The guest that we have for you today is one of my favorites that I've ever interviewed. I won't go too deep into it right now. I already gave the intro, but the bottom line is the way that Chris does his research has helped me in understanding more about history than I thought I wanted to learn when I picked up books that seem to solely focus on cannabis. I really get an awesome history lesson, archaeology, philosophy, ancient religions, scriptures that have been left behind. So super excited for this. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, pleasure to be here, Ben. Always great to talk to you, brother.
Yeah, man. Yeah, we got Gordon over here. You want to say hi?
Pleasure, guys.
Hey, Gordon,
glad to be here.
All right. Yeah, so we have an interesting conversation to dive into, and really, the way I'd like to dive into this is just really asking, like, what made cannabis the focus? So you have, just in front of me, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, where I first even heard the term cannabosum. Then you have Cannabis, the Soma Solution, then Liber 420, going back very distant across the globe. What made this one plant the focus in your authorship?
There's actually a book before those ones, Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana, and Magic and Religion. And it was actually the Tree of Life that got me into this. I had this wild religious experience about 31 years ago, and a series of events led up to it. First of this was there had been a real scandal here in Canada about an orphanage, Mount Cashel, that had been run by the Catholics, and kids that had been there were growing up and saying that they'd been molested by priests. So nobody was ever talking about this huge problem that we see nowadays with these pedophile priests. And I was really brought up with religion, but, I kind of accepted the basic Christian cosmology, I think just the cultural, societal view out there when I was a kid, and I was like, well, what's with this, man? It's like, why would somebody that was supposed to be doing all this good molest kids, And I thought, I'm going to read the Bible. And I started reading it, and I just couldn't make heads or tails of it. And at that time, I was living in this little fishing town called Occult on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I was really into surfing, and I grew a bit of weed. And I worked a few nights a week as a night watchman, gave me a lot of opportunity to read a lot of books. And coinciding with this, there had been a real scandal about the logging of the last old growth coastal rainforest. Clackwood Sound was world famous thing. and protesters started showing up. And I'd grown up with logging and fishing and stuff like that. So I was like, what? What's the problem here? And then I found out about the industrial uses for hemp. And at that time in Canada, all high times grow books were banned. And I started looking up in encyclopedias and finding out about all these industrial applications for hemp. For me, it was like building products and paper products we could make from and save our old growth forests. So I was like, oh, that's kind of a solution to the problem we're facing here. And then also coinciding this, the Gulf War started in Iraq. And Saddam was comparing himself to Nebuchadnezzar, the last king of Babylon, who overthrew the Jews, and he shot this Scud missile into Israel. And this was a real big thing at the time. And I knew about that. One night I was sitting in this fish plant smoking a joint, and I was reading the newspaper, and there was an ad for a sermon. TV ads were in newspapers back in those days before the internet. And I saw an ad for a sermon by Pat Robertson. It was Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon. And behind me, he had pictured tanks and jets. And I thought, whoa, I'm going to read the book of Revelation right now and find out what's up with that. And I grab the book of the Bible, I start reading it, and John, he takes a scroll and he puts it in his mouth. It tastes as sweet as honey, and then it turns bitter in his stomach. And then he begins to prophesy. So I was like, well, he's obviously eating something. And then I get a little bit further on, and they're talking about billowing clouds of incense for the prayers of the saints and sackcloth. And I'm like, this is all kind of weird shit. And I get to the end of the Bible, where it says, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had this really powerful experience. Still affects me every time I tell the story 30 years later, where I felt like light just like poured into me, and that this was a reference to cannabis and all its fruits, and where its multiple industrial applications that we could save the planet with, and medicines which we could heal ourselves with, and heal the world with, And I started really tripping out, and I called my first wife up at the time, and she started crying. She thought I was having some sort of mental breakdown or something. And the next day I got up and I couldn't decide, and I thought, well, this industrial stuff about cannabis, for sure that's true. So I'm going to start promoting that. If there's anything to this being some sort of spiritual, powerful thing, then somebody else somewhere else will have written about that, and they'll know about that. And I began just collecting everything I saw and filing it in this scrapbook having to do with cannabis and religion. I had no academic background at that time, and no historical interests or anything like that. And then over the years, it just started accumulating, and my knowledge base started growing with it. And now it's really solid information. And the really great thing is, things that I was writing about and suggesting have now been backed up by actual archaeological evidence.
Yeah. There's two things that come up when you say that. For one, it's kind of a tangent, but it's so often we hear that spiritual experiences from an outside perspective look like psychosis. And that's so. What year was this around that you had this revelation?
Around 1989, 1990, in that winter there. I don't know whether it was on either side of December, January there, but right around that time period then.
So like nobody was writing about the things that you were coming, because like there are other authors that are coming out saying like, the scroll in the mouth, but back then there was nothing really out there talking about this, and that just came to you not through research but an insight.
Yeah,
that's pretty wild.
And I guess when I thought of the Tree of Life thing at the time, I was thinking like, this must be what these Rastafarian dudes were talking about. I knew about Bob Marley, but it wasn't really my thing. You know what I mean? And so I was like, well, this must be it. And since then, I've met other people that have had similar experiences. I don't think it's anything that's like localized to myself or anything like that by any means. I've met many people in the cannabis reform movement who feel like they've had some sort of spiritual awakening around this plant. And I think what it is we're tapping into some sort of like ancestral memory about this particular plant, because it's played a paramount role in so many cultures, particularly in the background of Indo-European culture and Proto-Indo-European culture. And through those origins, it likely affects almost all of us that our genetic ancestors likely partook of this plant as a sacrament at some point.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're communing with it, you're accessing even those moments in time that have happened before with the greater plant. You know, we don't have to get into the morphogenetic, you know, blueprint of it, but, you know, basically you're tapping back into the history of it. And what's nice about that is you don't hear about people having these revelations, not that I have, without having actually partaken of the sacrament of the plant. And so there's something about that that seems to come about. I find that fascinating because there is something so interesting about this one plant. I mean, there's a lot of fascinating plants out there, but when it comes to, you know, when this, I think one of the most interesting parts of our history is when this one plant went from being used all over the world medicinally to all of a sudden being put on Schedule 1 next to what kinds of drugs? Like, we're talking heroin and cocaine. And I hadn't even thought of it. I remember watching this one thing where Joe Rogan was saying, like, oh, and cocaine was, I think, Schedule 2 at the time. And he was just like, oh, so cannabis is a gateway drug into cocaine, a lesser dangerous drug.
Yeah.
You know, that's how stupid the classifications are. This plant has... There's no documented killing of anybody directly by an overdose using this plant. What are your thoughts on, like, was this just how things happen to play out? Or, like, it almost feels like there was this force knowing that this plant is too good to be true. It can take over all the paper. It can, you know, make oil. You can make a car out of it. It won't dent. You know, we need to stifle it. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, there's an interesting analogy with the Garden of Eden myth, right? Because, you know, God said, oh, on the day you eat of that, you're going to die. And the serpent was like, you're not going to die. Your eyes are going to be opened and you'll be able to discern good and evil. And he didn't die. Their eyes were open. You know what I mean? So God was a liar in that story. And I think there's like a parallel there that the prohibition of cannabis has turned it into this powerful symbol and force of freedom. And, you know, like Jack Herer, he claimed that the prohibition was a conspiracy. Jack Herer is the famous author of The Emperor Wears No Clothes, the hemp conspiracy, really kind of the grandfather of the industrial hemp movement and a big influence in marijuana legalization globally. I knew Jack. And his theory was that the DuPonts had patented all these petroleum byproducts and got in cahoots with Henry, I'm trying to think of the newspaper guy back in the 30s there, famous billionaire, millionaire guy. I forget his name, but he was a newspaper guy that really promoted a lot of anti-marijuana and reefer madness hysteria. And he had all sorts of timber holdings, you know what I mean? And then these guys conspired to outlaw hemp. And I kind of think that, I don't know if I believe that. I think that there was a bit of a perfect storm there. You know, before this, a lot of stuff is made from the rubber plant, and that went by the wayside as well. And when people started to realize all these things you can make out of oil, at the time, it just seemed like there's this endless supply of this useless goop that you're just going to be able to turn into all these products. So they just thought, you know, that's kind of where the cheapest outlay was, right? I think it had a lot more to do with racism, you know, and it had long been out of European Western culture as a drug of choice. And it was mostly being used in this time by Black jazz musicians and Mexicans. And it was easy to demonize those people. We see this with opium in Canada as well, with the Chinese, you know what I mean? Similar pogrom, racial, immigrant type of thing, same sort of thing you kind of hear out of people like the Trump administration, right? And so I think there was kind of a perfect storm there. And the way that it was kind of causing this like breakdown of long established cultural barriers between whites and other people, particularly in the jazz club scene, you know, where you're starting to see blacks and whites and Jews like Mesmero, where, you know, he was like a big figure in cannabis in the 30s, 20s, and even called cannabis after him, the Mighty Mez, you know, you know, it was this like culture milieu that was breaking all of these long established racial prejudice and cultural prejudice. And that was a threat to the established order, a very real threat. That's, I think, where the origins prohibition really lay.
That's interesting you say that. Not to go on a tangent, but it really even seems like even today with the thing about race being still just very present and in front of us. This wouldn't be my theory, but it almost just feels like it was kind of pushed to be that way, whereas there's this plant that you would see it passed around in clubs, and people of all different colors would be sharing this joint, this pipe, right? Almost like the peace pipe. And we couldn't have that, and I definitely think that was a big part of that. I also feel like it almost feels like there's some kind of lesson in it that's just that, if there is a lesson in it that wants to get out, what was stifled back then that could get out now that cannabis is coming, back into the public eye without such disdain and fear and disinformation around it. That's why I like what you're working on. You're not just looking into the history of it, but in our interviews, you brought me all the way through the prohibition into what's happening with cannabis today, with industry. So I guess I have to ask for people out there. I mean, obviously the cannabis industry went, like gangbusters over the past decade, a little over a decade. What do you like about where it's all headed, and where do you think there's room for improvement as corporations and industry starts getting its fingers on this one plant? Like it's done it with so many, like soy, wheat, corn, all these other plants in the past. How do you think we could improve with this specific plant moving forward as it becomes industrialized?
Well, I've been a cannabis activist for like over 30 years, right? And I've been through the process of seeing the legalization of industrial hemp here, medical cannabis, and now recreational cannabis in Canada, right? But I've always had my own agenda, and my agenda is still yet to come. And it has to do with all this religious stuff, because I think that cannabis offers humanity this great paradigm shift, and we'll probably get into that later. Industry-wise, initially what happened here in Canada is, as we move towards legalization, all of a sudden politicians and cops that we fought against trying to legalize cannabis, like literally fought against these actual individuals, not just as groups of police and politicians, ended up as they really went corporate, and they made the regulations so stringent it was going to be hard for anybody to get into it unless you had millions of dollars to play with in a huge corporate model, right? And what they found is that just the black market continued on and thrived. And many of these corporations have now gone bankrupt and are going bankrupt. And so now they're having to look at things and consider a more of a craft industry, more along the lines of craft beer and cottage wine industry type of model, right? And that's a lot better, because cannabis is for everybody, And I think it's important to remember, in these different legalization efforts in the states and countries, that in legislative politics, these things always happen in steps. It's never big leaps, and a lot of people will fight against that what could be great incremental change, because they don't feel that it's going far enough, that it's not offering enough of some people just aren't going to be happy until they can grow cannabis in their backyard and sell it out of their front yard. And that's an unrealistic goal right off the bat. You know what I mean? There's going to be some sort of legislation and reintroduction. That's just the reality of legislative politics and the democratic system. So people need to start working with that and realizing when something happens in, like with Canada, for instance, where it was taken over, there's this huge corporate model that's not holding up. And here we are a few years later, and it's starting to break down, and they're making a much more inclusive playing ground for cannabis, and that's what we want to see, right? Industrial-wise, there's not nearly enough happening. You know what I mean? Governments are still subsidizing these oil companies, and these oil companies have vested interest in Mideast oil instead of oil produced here in Canada. For instance, we can supply all of our own fossil fuels, right? And so there's not nearly enough research research and efforts going into bringing things like biomass fuels and making them a reality, or even with fiber cloth. The only real industrial industry I see taking off here in Canada so far has been the seed industry, which is huge. And I was actually the first person to commercially sell hemp seed food. This was like in 1991. I had a business, Mama Indica's Hemp Seed Treats, and I sold those all over North America and even exported them off the continent. Now I go into any grocery store and I see a variety of dehulled hemp seed food products, and it's an amazing superfood. And we can feed the world's hungry with that as well, right? So there's not nearly enough stuff happening with cannabis, and I think that there's lots of room for building. Building products are starting to take off on there. Things like hemp treat, we're starting to see a lot more action with that type of stuff, and I look forward to seeing more and more, even like car parts and stuff like that, or the plastics. And now they're talking batteries and stuff like that. And and so I hope that there's more and more of that type of stuff. And I think that right now, the paradigm shift is, we could go the way of the Trumps and the Koch brothers and the fossil fuel industry and end up with a dying and dead planet, or we can start, going green technology and move, taking things like hemp and bamboo and exploring the possibilities there. With renewable building products and renewable energies, and start moving there. And we're at this important shift in politics and culture and even religion. That's all kind of combined as one part and parcel thing. I don't know which way humanity's going to go. I have my days where I kind of lose faith in the bigger picture. You know what I mean? I don't think there's a problem facing humanity today that we don't already have answers for. That all the answers are out there. The challenge is implementing them in the current, political climate. You know what I mean? We've just gotten away from Trump back into Biden. But the type of shifts we need to reverse things like greenhouse warming and economic change and stuff like that, it's, going to be kind of like the same sort of system as we saw under previous Democratic administrations, maybe a little bit better than the Republicans, but there's never that movement, that sort of drastic shift that we really, really need to do. That's like, that's the reality of the situation. We need to make big change. And if we don't make big change, maybe things like COVID will make the change for us.
Yeah, no, you're definitely speaking some truth here. I mean, I feel that one thing about the current way that just government has control is there's a lot of liability. There's a lot of, we need to do things. I like the incremental way that you're talking about, but in some ways it feels like it moves at a snail's pace that to get real movement done, it would take huge actions all at once, like huge bursts. And sometimes those aren't sustainable. It catches people off guard. What it sounds like to me that you're talking about is like, you're right, the solutions are there. And just look at this one plant, and we're barely we're definitely not maximizing. I could say we probably scratched the surface, but we're not maximizing the use out of this plant, mainly because of litigation, ink on paper, and ways, we haven't set up the agreements, and the infrastructure is there. And I see what you're saying. Like, there's so much we could be doing with this plant. It's just not, it hasn't congealed yet. So I do have hope for things moving in that direction. When I'm looking at the future, and I have something specific in mind, I think it actually does have to do more with religion and the religious use or the sacramental use of cannabis, other plants. I see a big resurgence in this. When you see the future of cannabis that excites you, even if it it doesn't look like there's much movement, but I see this as where it obviously needs to go. What does that? I mean, is the religious side the thing that you said? That's kind of where you're seeing a lot of your attention go.
Yeah, my view, has always been, people aren't going to be ready for the Tree of Life or Soma or Hilma or Cannabisum until they're well familiar with things like industrial hemp and medical cannabis, right? And so the agenda has always been to try to massively educate the public on that. You know, and I spent years working for Pot TV and writing for magazines like Cannabis Culture and High Times, and speaking at rallies, you know, about these things without often even mentioning anything about religious use, even though I had a wealth of information even back then on it, you know. I think that this information, you know, like say the archaeology out of Arad, Jerusalem, you know, they found 800 years ago in Arad, Jerusalem, at an altar site that two altars, stone altars, in a temple site that was, say, about the size of a walk-in closet, maybe like 6 by 8 or so, and on one of these altars, frankincense was burned, and on the other altar, cannabis resin was burned, right? And this is radical information, you know, like Haaretz and other BBC and other papers are talking about Israelites using cannabis for religious ecstasy. You know, religious ecstasy, that means that's how they talk to God. Now, this was something that I've been suggesting based on etymological evidence for decades. Based on the etymological research of the Polish anthropologist and etymologist Sula Bennett, who first wrote in the 1930s how this Hebrew term cannabosum was actually a reference to cannabis that appeared in Exodus, Song of Songs, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And it was mistranslated when the Hebrew texts were translated into Greek. And the mistranslation, that's like around 300 BC, and then the mistranslation followed through in later translation. The mistranslation was calamus, which was a common marsh fruit. But the descriptions of cannabosum did not fit with this designation. And in the Hebrew world, rabbis themselves were undecided as to what this term means. Some rabbis acknowledged that it could well mean cannabis based on the cognate pronunciation of it and the similarity to the Talmudic term cannabis, which was a reference to cannabis, and earlier Assyrian terms to kanabu, which is a reference to cannabis. But others were saying it was lemongrass, type of cinnamon, and it was long-held debate. Now with this archaeological information that we have, this is confirmation of cannabosum, and it fits perfectly with this etymological information, right? See, this etymological information was very puzzling to me when I first came across it, because the initial reference where it occurs is in Exodus 30:23, and God commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil with about 6 pounds of cannabis mixed with myrrh and cinnamon into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time he's to speak to the Lord, he goes into this enclosed little place, kind of like this temple structure that they found in Arad, the tent of the meeting, and he burns some of this oil on the altar of incense, and then he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. But by the end references, say in Jeremiah, it's actually condemned in Jeremiah's, what do I care of this incense of Sheba? This kind of from a distant land is not pleasing to me, you know, as Jeremiah's lambasted. So what happened? How did something that was once precious become so condemned? You know what I mean? And so I spent about 4 or 5 years with a friend of mine, Neil McQueen, who had a degree in religious studies and a degree in Hebrew. And we got to know these references in the context of the biblical storyline. And the story that it reveals is a radical shift in religious view that I think is as much a paradigm shift in thinking for our culture as Darwin's theory of evolution was in comparison to the well-accepted myths of Genesis and the creation of Adam and Eve, because what it reveals is the plant-based shamanic origins of religion and how this came to pass, and then how it came to be shut down and shut out of history. So we lost contact with it, right? And the key here is in some of these later references, cannabis appears in the Song of Songs, which is a beautiful piece of poetry, one of the nicest pieces of work in the whole Bible. It's talking about the sacred marriage of a man and a woman, or a king and a queen, or possibly a god and his goddess, because what we know now is that at one time, God, Yahweh of the Bible, Jehovah, or whatever you want to call him, had a wife. And her name was Asherah. And this is even referred to in Kings and Chronicles. They're talking about all the polytheistic worship, the Asherah being right inside the temple. And this is what they're saying about this temple site in Arad, is there was 2 altars there and 2 stelas on the other side of these altars, and that one of these was for Yahweh and one of these was for Asherah. And archaeologists have found numbers of inscriptions from this time period that refer to Yahweh and his Asherah, which is his wife, the female goddess. And William M. Bowden, a botanist, he says this particular cult, Asherah, that the devotees of it, the priestesses, burned cannabis and anointed their skin with it in a similar way to the Yahwehists were, right? And we see that in some of these other references, such as Isaiah, God's mad because canna is not brought from. You have not brought any canna for me, but you put all your sins on me, you know? And that's because there's a polytheistic type of situation where Asherah, Baal, and other deities are being worshipped in Israel. It's a polytheistic religion. And everybody wants the cannabisum because when you burn the cannabisum in the temple, the gods speak a little better. And, you know, I think there's like a real analogy here, right? You know, like you got to remember, music was originally a shamanic tool used for invoking the spirit into a temple setting. And so oftentimes things like cannabis and other entheogens were used in a ritual type of setting where there'd be drums beating, music going, a repetitive beat, and all the smoke. And then much like a rapper today, inspired by the blunt cannabis, you know, and that the voice starts coming in their head, and then they start laying out the lyrics. And much of the religious texts of the ancient world are written in this manner, in a poetic kind of delivery, because that's the way it came out. And then people would sit there and write it all down as the people were singing to it and getting off in this kind of ritual environment, right? And so there was like a challenge to get a hold of this because everybody wanted it for their temple. Another issue is that religion at this time is like politics. There's no firm division between politics and religion. And whoever has the ear of the king, their religion is going to be particularly powerful, right? And at this time in Israel's being attacked by Babylonians, Assyrians, other kingdoms, right? And having all these different deities worship is really a division of power. And monotheism may well have been an attempt to consolidate political power as much as religious power. And it was happening right at the closing period, right after they were dominated by a series of other empires for a number of centuries, right? And so by the time of Jeremiah, it's completely fallen out, and it's clear with Jeremiah, this has to do with the suppression of the goddess, because in Jeremiah 44, he's lambasting Jews living in Egypt for burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, right? And so this is coinciding with the suppression of cannabisum as well, right? And you got to think about how that, you know, cannabis is one thing, but when you suppress the goddess, you're suppressing the divine feminine, you know? And that has had unprecedented historical effect on our culture worldwide. Yep. And the treatment of women. You know, we're talking women just got to vote decades ago. You know what I mean? Not even a century ago. Still fighting for equal rights. And that suppression of the feminine, the unnatural, because, you know, probably the goddess was worshipped long before God. You know, certainly evidence is regarding cannabis that, you know, there's references to the Assyrian Kanabu, to Ishtar and Isherah, a very, very ancient Near Eastern goddess whose worship can be traced back 4,000 years. There's references to cannabis being used in their particular cults, right? And so it's likely that this was long in use, even before Yahweh was developed as a god and a concept, and long before the concept of monotheism had been established in Israel, even from the biblical descriptions itself. And so it's pretty radical information, you know, particularly like when you're throwing cannabis in the temple with figures like Moses and Isaiah. There's a great scene in Isaiah where he's in the temple and it says, and then one of the seraphim flew unto me with a live coal in hand he had taken with tongs from off the altar, and he laid it to my lips, and lo, my iniquity was taken away and my sin was purged. So they literally going to the altar and grabbing a burning coal of resin from the altar with tongs, then holding it right up to the mouth so you could get a really nice direct hit there, And when you throw that in there to the smoky tent of the meeting with Moses and he's speaking to the Lord of the pillar of smoke, the radical thing is he becomes like a shaman who are shaman today in South America or Africa are using substances like ayahuasca and iboga to cross the bridge into the other world, and receive divine information. And Moses, in this case, is burning cannabis in a smoky tent of the meeting, and he's going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And a voice comes out of the smoke and says, this is what you shall do. And this is like, this is shamanism, man. That's what it is.
Yeah. What's really interesting, I can see why in that timeline you touched upon political and religious being one, no division there, and there being something about this plant. So I guess my question is, it's twofold. Like, I guess I can see the connection between the feminine and also this plant, and I can see the use of it. What was the accessibility of this plant like back then? Like, give us a picture of it. It was probably transported a lot on the Silk Road, correct? And you mentioned, and maybe if you could bring this up, 4,000 years ago, or was it 4,000 BC in present day Uzbekistan, the Gunur Tepe?
I don't know about Gunur Tepe, but there's like a BMAC in Afghanistan, Bacteria Margiana Archaeological.
That's what they call that. I think I even read that in your book. It's another name for it. So there's Göbekli Tepe, and they call BMAC Gunur Tepe. That's like another name for it. Check that out. But I guess what I'm saying is accessibility in the old world. So we're in Egypt or right around Jerusalem. How accessible by your research, do you feel like it was then?
Yeah, I think it was kind of a rare and pricey commodity myself. And this is what they're saying about this archaeological find, is that there's no evidence that cannabis was grown in Israel. They can tell this by strata, and so that it was imported. And this is what the references to cannabosum say as well. It's described as an item of trade coming in a caravan in Ezekiel, and Jeremiah describes it as canna from a distant land, right? And so I think it's likely, and this is where it kind of connects with Soma and Haoma, is it's likely coming up from China and then coming down through Afghanistan and then into the Holy Land and also into India, splitting off from there as well. And this has got to do with a lot of archaeology. Maybe we should shift into Soma now, because this has to do with the same Soma trail. You see, canna itself is actually an Indo-European word. The root word for cannabis is thought to be Proto-Indo-European. So even before the Indo-European culture split off into its different variants and languages, French, English, German, Sanskrit, all these different languages, which have the common root of Indo-European languages, right? Even before that split, there was a word for cannabis. And that's canna in the Proto-Indo-European language. At least this is what linguists and etymologists, people who study language, say, right? It's not like there's a written dictionary of Proto-Indo-European languages surviving 5,000 years, but based on what they know about it, they think the Proto-Indo-European root was canna. And we know that cannabis was in use by Proto-Indo-Europeans, because now through DNA evidence, they have settled on where the Proto-Indo-European homeland was. There was a lot of debate about this at one time, but it's in Romania, Ukraine, around that region there. And in regards to cannabis, we have evidence of cannabis being burnt at funerary rituals, at sites of funerals, going back 5,500 years. They found a 5,500-year-old smoking cup, they call it, a little cup used for burning cannabis, and you'd inhale the fumes sitting over top of it in Romania. And they've also found similar bowls in a cave in the Ukraine from 5,000 years. This particular area in Ukraine is interesting because this was the home of the Stradeni stog, and they're thought to have been the first domesticators of a horse, and horse domestication itself is believed to have resulted from the development and technology of hemp ropes. Can corral horses and hold on to them without ropes, right? And so this explains the spread of cannabis by later nomadic groups, by this, like the Scythians, who are thought to have taken this and spread it throughout much of the ancient world and the culture, right? And so the Scythians are interesting because they're a few thousand years after this time period with the Proto-Indo-Europeans, 5,500 years ago, coming to about 2,500, 2,800 years ago, around there. You know, they were really dominating. And we know Herodotus, the Greek historian, had written how the Scythians would burn cannabis at funerary rites by heating up stones, putting them in braziers, and then putting the brazier in a little tent and throwing cannabis on the rocks and then inhaling the fumes. This was thought to be mythology, but then in the 1940s, a Russian archaeologist, Sergio Rudenko, discovered a Scythian tomb that had all these implements, braziers with rocks with burnt cannabis seeds in them, and a tent structure for inhaling it. And since that time, there's been numbers of finds of these Scythian braziers and tents used for it, as well as gold cups that were used for drinking cannabis and opium preparations, and then a bone cup with cannabis residues, and a flask. Flasks were usually used for keeping alcohol and drinks in that showed residues of cannabis. So they were both burning and drinking cannabis. Now, it's interesting because coinciding with the Scythians, and these guys were over in the steppes, the Russian steppes, Black Sea region around there. But in China, there's another Indo-European group, and this group here is thought to have broken off near the inception of the Indo-Europeans, right around, just as they're shifting in from Proto-Indo-European to Indo-European, because they're believed to have been speakers of the Tocharian language. And this is putting us into the sort of time frame that they think the Vedic religion split off from the other Indo-European groups, right? And in China, they have found numerous tomes that have revealed female cannabis, quality resin cannabis. These tomes are in a cold desert region that preserves material very well. So there was still green cannabis that was found in a basket, about 2 pounds of cultivated female cannabis. They found another tome with cannabis buds laid over top of the body, like a bouquet of cannabis, and other tomes with cannabis. And they found another psychoactive medicinal plant in this region as well, ephedra. And this is, up in this area. Now, this is these finds here are about 2,800, 2,500 years ago. So around the same time as the Scythian, but they're like a huge stretch of real estate apart from each other, right? You know what I mean? And so this shows that this earlier Proto-Indo-European ritual use of cannabis in funerary rites had continued independently in these two vastly separated strains of Indo-European culture. Now, we were talking about these places in the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. This brings us to the work of the Russian archaeologist Victor Sarianati. And he says in these sites, he had found 3 temples, and 2 of these temples, these temples about the size of a football field, and he says half the temple site was dedicated to making the sacred beverage, Soma. And he says at 2 of the sites he found evidence of both cannabis and ephedra, and then at one of the sites, cannabis, ephedra, and opium. Now, interestingly, a linguist and etymologist named Magickal, he's had even before this archaeology out of China about these mummies, he had a long-standing etymological theory about how the term Heoma came about, relating to Chinese. And a Chinese name for cannabis in the same period was Huma, and that's been translated both as Scythian cannabis and as fire cannabis, because they were burning it, right? And there's an interesting relationship. I mentioned that they found ephedra in some of these tomes as well. There's an interesting relationship in China with cannabis where they can share the names. Or one will be Mahu and one will be Huma, you know what I mean? Reversing the names. There's almost a yin-yang kind of relationship here. One's an energizing plant, one's a relaxing plant. And around this same time period, we see a lot of references to cannabis in Taoist literature, very much like Soma. It's referred to as a plant of immortality, and it's being used as an incense to see spirits and kind of funerary type stuff, right? You know, go to the afterworld and stuff like that. And so Mandy Hassan says this term was adopted by the Indo-Europeans in China. And we know that this group was in trade. This is all part of the Silk Road. This discovery in China, before this, they thought the Silk Road was maybe like 200 BC. Now it's back 1,000 years before that, right? And we know that this group was in trade with the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex because of artifacts found between the two sites. And the DNA, and they've also found cowrie shells from India in this site in China, right? So that goes to show the expanse of this trade network that was already established, right? You know, huge. And it's interesting here because the Scythians likely transferred back and forth between these cultures. And one of the names that the Scythians in this region were known by was Heoma Varga, the Heoma gatherers. And the ancient writers referred to how they both burnt and drank Heoma. And so it seems likely that the original name for cannabis went by the wayside, this particularly potent Chinese variety, and they can tell that this was a particularly bred for resin type of cannabis from the residues that they found. And they found braziers there as well. That's another big part about this Chinese things. Not bronze braziers like in the Scythian sites, but they were wood braziers, but the exact same style. Rocks heated up, cannabis thrown on them, exact same way. Right. So the idea is that the Scythians bring this into the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, where Serianati claimed he found evidence that cannabis and ephedra were used to prepare the original Heoma. It comes down with that name Huma, and this becomes Heoma once it reaches Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, right? Now, this was probably, these trade routes were coming in from a number of different, going off to different Scythian groups and trade networks. And we know they operated that way. The royal Scyths acted as kind of emissaries between different settled outposts of Scythians, right? And we know in Israel that they were pretty active. There was a town there, Scythopolis. Right in Israel, right? You know what I mean? And they know artifacts of Scythians were there, right? So it likely came with Scythian traders and other trade caravans with the original Indo-European name, Canna, and then was adopted into a very similar way. They're burning it inside a closed tent, much like the Scythians were doing, and for similar purposes, So yeah, it's I think this is, when you consider, like, then this Heoma goes into India, the Heoma, the Zoroastrian religion forms out of that, right? That whole culture, the Mazdian religion, and that's like hugely influential on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then when it goes into India, in the Vedic religion, it's like becomes Soma through further linguistic changes. And this is like the foundation of the Hindu religion. This led to Buddhism, Sikhism, and we've already seen in China how this influenced in Taoism, right? And so right in that, we're talking about the root of the oldest existing world religions here, man. That's radical stuff, man,
It really is. And so, a couple things come up for me. One is specifically, you mentioned ephedra and cannabis having this kind of like paired relationship. And I don't want to go too deep into this because I want to get back to Soma, but have you tried that combination of ephedra and cannabis?
I have not. It's hard to get a hold of raw ephedra here, right? You know what I mean? You can get a hold of ephedra extracts. And I'm not like super attracted to speedy concoctions, you know? You got to remember, ephedra is like the base for methamphetamine and stuff, right? And it can really speed you up. And there were massive reforms around Hayoma by Zoroaster, a prophet of the massive religion that led to the Zoroastrian religion, caused a huge shift in the religion. And there were, like in his opinion, there were all-night orgies taking place with the consumption of Hayoma. There's probably people really buzzing on ephedra. Now, ephedra is still in the Zoroastrian Hayoma, whereas cannabis is not. But we see in later Zoroastrian texts, such as the Denkard and the Book of Ardu Viraf and the Bundashin, that cannabis was mixed with wine at this time for religious ecstasy. And that's something that Pliny mentioned about the Bactria Margiana area, is these infused wines like Potamoganius and all these different names, but they were clearly infused wines, you know?
Right. So Soma specifically. So you're saying it was brought into, because I know, you know, when you're looking at Shiva and the origins of Shiva, this was, you know, his connections with cannabis seems to be quite clear, and I'd like you to show a little bit about that. But so cannabis made its way down into India, probably from more in China somewhere.
Yeah, well, it came with the Aryans. It's like they know that in southern India, where the Aryans came into, that cannabis was not grown in that region through the similar type of pollen strata and that sort of thing, and it's thought to have been brought in by these same Aryans who brought in the Vedic religion, right? And they mostly worship Indra, and most of the Soma worship was to Indra. There is a figure in the Vedas that is thought to be Shiva, Rudra, but it's also thought that Shiva and Kali both were indigenous Indian deities worshipped by the Dravidian society that predated the Vedic culture that came into India, right? And that they were adapted into that pantheon, right? Now there's debate about this. And the issue of an Aryan invasion itself is like a hot topic. In India, there's a real national desire to have everything be Indian and everything originating in India. We see this in China as well as kind of a controversy with these Chinese mummies, because it means that certain cultural things like domestication of the horse, the making of bronze, may have been brought in by Indo-Europeans into China, and they don't like that. A similar situation in India with the nationality there, because the whole racism of the caste system in India, right? It's the lighter you are, the closer you are to those original Aryans, and the darker you are on the lower end of the spectrum you are. And this has been, a massive racist issue, right? So these are pretty touchy issues, right? But the general view is that Shiva and Kali were in India, and then they were adopted into this Vedic pantheon. And you can kind of see a transition happening where Indra, who's the very pinnacle of the Vedic pantheon, he goes into disfavor. You barely even hear about him now. He's a very minor figure in India, and Shiva rises to the top. And all this seems to me to be based around where cannabis disappears in India, so as Soma, and we can see this starting to books like the Sapatatha Brahmana and some of these texts written around in the later Vedic period. They begin to refer to the problems that they're having getting a hold of good Soma. It's showing up by the time it gets there, it's old and ragged. And it's also taxed heavily. Vedic culture was very ritualistic. Everything you did, getting married, having a child, buying a cow, had to have prayers, and you had to pay the Vedic priest and blah, blah, blah. Same with Soma. There was a whole Vedic ritual that went with this preparation. People had to be paid out. The Soma vendor had to be paid. Everybody's getting a piece of the action. And it's getting harder and harder to get, as probably it gets more popular too in between. Where it's coming from in India, right? And so substitutions and things started coming into play. And coinciding with this, there's all these reforms with Buddhism. Buddhism was a real reaction to all this ritualism of daily Vedic life, and it got rid of all that. And this is also where we see the ban on alcohol and meat eating taking place, is with the rise of Buddhism, right? And so all this stuff goes by the wayside here, right? Now Hinduism does start to come back, and we can see in the myth, the churning of the ocean of the milk, which is a really important Vedic myth, and it's the basis of the Kumbh Mela, one of the biggest, largest continual human gatherings on the planet, probably the biggest, largest continual human gathering on the planet. And in the churning of the ocean of milk, what happens is there's a shift from Indra worship over to Shiva, and from Soma use over to Shiva's sacred bong in the mythology that takes place in there, right? And basically in the myth, Indra is on his elephant, and he insults an aspect of Shiva, a sadhu, the incarnation of Shiva, when he offers his elephant a flower necklace. And he gets a curse called down on him. And so what happens is the other deities, Krishna, Brahma, and Shiva, now back in his god form, Shiva, Vishnu, and Krishna, they go off and they see Brahma, they tell him what happened. And he's like, well, you insulted this, and this has brought down a curse on the three worlds. What you need to do is you need to get potent herbs and churn them into the ocean of milk, and regain the Amrita. And Amrita is often associated with Soma. It's also the Vedic counterpart of the Greek term ambrosia, sacred drink of the gods, right? Mm. And so they get the mountain maru and this big snake that they tie around the mountain maru, and they get the demons to help them, and they churn the ocean of milk, and out of it comes poison at first, and Shiva drinks that, and it turns blue in his throat and saves the world, and then finally the Amrita pops out, as well as wine and other things pop out as well. But and to prevent the demons from getting a hold of it, they tricked into helping them churn the ocean of milk with the potent herbs to get it. The Garuda bird flies off with it. And where it drops on the earth, in the 4 spots, this is where they have the Kumbh Mela. And it also is said in mythology that cannabis sprung from one of these same drops. And so cannabis is like the earthly Amrita. But now, rather than Indra, it's in devotion to Shiva. And at the Kumbh Mela, you see the devotees of Shiva partaking of shitchilams in honor of his own. It's thought to be born from his own body, even in honor of that. And before that, they were often drinking bang, and still drink bang on Shiva Ratri and other holidays devoted to Shiva. Cannabis probably consumed.
Can you touch on that, like bong? So, I know when most people first hear that, they think of Shiva's bong as something probably different. It's not an herb that you smoke. It's actually a drink.
It's a drink.
So,
very similar.
Could you explain what's in it?
Yeah. Well, it's a very similar preparation to cannabis, what Soma was, right? They describe Soma, being beaten with rocks, and the rocks going green from it, and mixed with milk and barley and honey and things, And similarly, cannabis, bong is a drink made from cannabis, pulverized with a mortar and pestle, mixed in cardamom and nutmeg, and different herbs are pulverized in with it. And then this is mixed with milk and made into bong lassi, which is kind of like a cannabis milkshake. And it's drunk at a lot of festivals in India, like the Festival of Colors, where they throw the paint and dye on each other, Shiva Ratri, and it's also used in tantric rituals. In tantric rituals, they refer to it by the Vedic name Vijaje, which means victory, and that got that name from the churning of the ocean milk myth that I referred to earlier, right? Shiva's victory, in reclaiming the Amrita. It's a similar type of ritual thing. It's just free of a lot of that ritual Vedic stuff that was around with Soma and the complications of it. It's more freely available to everybody. That's really, I think a big thing about Shaivism. It's like the caste system is really involved in a lot of these other deities, but Shiva is like wide open, man. It's like, all people, all castes, all gender, all that type of stuff, man. It's just like, Shiva's God of the people, man.
Yeah, very accepting. So one thing most of the audience would probably know this, but um, is it decarboxylated? And that for the audience, that just means that the cannabis is activated. THCA goes to THC, which makes it psychoactive. Is the bong lassi, is it activated first? So this is psychoactive brew.
It can be heated. In some cases it is heated, but I think in the ancient world there wasn't a need for that because ultraviolet light decarboxylates cannabis as well. And this was how cannabis was dried in those days. Any sort of cannabis that you see that's been dried that's like golden brown, where it's like it starts to get those type of colors. Age will also convert THCA to THC as well, right? So both sunlight and age will do the job on their own. And I'm assuming most of the cannabis that these people were dealing with wasn't like fresh off the field. So yeah. And what's interesting is even with fresh cannabis, I've seen a couple of videos on YouTube where people have made fresh cannabis and gotten high off of it.
Me. Yeah. I have a story where, so I harvested a bunch of water leaves and sugar leaves, and this was to make juice out of it. And basically, so I put it in the blender, and then I drank the juice of it afterwards, and I was on my ass for a while, and I had no idea because I was like, did the blender do that? Did it speed up? But it didn't heat it up. So something there, like some process of decarboxylation happened there from fresh water leaves and sugar leaves. And just for the audience, the water leaves are those big fan leaves. The sugar leaves are the smaller ones that more of the THC crystals get on. But unless you heat it and they're fresh off the leaves, usually you could just eat those leaves and you're fine. And for me, that wasn't the case. So yeah, I can attest to that.
This exact situation that you're talking about, and somebody proving it to somebody else that was like, no, it's got to be decarbed, and that's not the case. I don't know what the function is, but theoretically too, maybe just the smashing of rocks would work the same way as the whatever's happening in the process of the blender. There's some unknowns there, clearly, because these are actual situations where people are getting high off fresh cannabis, and it's not even mixed with oil or butter or milk or a fatty thing. It's even cannabis that's just prepared with water, juice. So that's another aspect of it as well.
That's pretty wild. I want to take us forward in time a little bit and touch base on Liber 420. There's so much in here to get into, but like first and foremost, like right there on the cover is Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Okay, and
then
I
interviewed. There's two South African professors, Francis Thackeray and Nicholas Vandermeer, archaeologists and paleontologists, and they had a theory based on Shakespeare's sonnets that Shakespeare, he refers to this noted weed in his sonnets, and based on this theory that they developed, they were able to get the Avalon Trust, who was in charge of the property and where Shakespeare lived, and they got pipes that were found on the property from the time period that Shakespeare lived, and they tested them, and they found evidence of cannabis resins in the pipes from Shakespeare's time period, right? And this is interesting because Shakespeare actually worked in some cannabis mythology into Midsummer Night's Dream. He has Puck in there. Puck's actually also referred to as Robin Goodfellow in Midsummer Night's Dream. And Robin Goodfellow is this deity that was apparently worshipped by witches at one time. And his catchphrase was hemp and happen. And he has all sorts of folk tales and stuff of his involvement with hemp, where he'd break the fibers off by having sex on top of a bunch of laid down hemp stalk and banging so hard it breaks all the fibers up and makes it ready to be made into rope and cloth and stuff. And it also has Oberon on it. There's actually a 16th century grimoire, the Book of Oberon, which has a recipe for a cannabis topical ointment to be used with magic mirrors to see spirits and demons. And there's also a poem about riding to the Sabbath, the gathering of the fairies and stuff like that on a hemp stalk. That's about Oberon as well from that time period. So it's very interesting stuff, and there was definitely magical use in England of cannabis at that time. It's in a number of grimoires, Sefer Raziel, Liber Salomonis, the Cunning Man's Grimoire, and the Book of Oberon, to name three off the top of my head.
Man, so you mentioned so the magic mirrors. This would have to do with scrying, correct? Like this is an obsidian crystal, and so when I was going into some of my research on Sir John Dee, and I know you write about him, I found a couple things which I won't get into right now, but so apparently John Dee's sacred mirror was attained from the plundering of Montezuma. Is that correct? Do you know?
I've heard something about that. Yeah, it came from South America, a black obsidian mirror or something. Yeah.
Right. And what's strange about it is I think when I was digging deep into this, I found that they would call it a speculum. Have you heard of that? The sacred mirror, they would call it a speculum.
I think I have heard that name in use. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like. To me, I haven't made heads or tails of it yet. It's something very interesting that I'm also finding with, like, as it goes forward, you see all these companies called BlackRock and Blackstone, and these are huge investment firms out of New York. And what they do all day long is speculation. They make value out of speculation. So without getting too deeply into that, I want to get into Sir John Dee and how important was he in that time, because we know he was with Queen Elizabeth Tudor. He was an advisor. And what was his relationship with, just plants in general in his practice of magic and also maybe cannabis?
Okay, so like those grimoires that I referred to earlier, those are grimoires that were written in English and Latin that were in England at the time of John Dee that were specifically referring to the use of cannabis for scrying mirrors. So Dee was like all about these sorts of books. So it's pretty unlikely that he would not have been aware of this. There is references to smoky type of situations in the actions. That's what he referred to his scrying episodes. Usually it would be Edward Kelly, his assistant, would do the scrying, and John Dee would write down what Kelly told him. And there is clear references to smoky fumigation type situations during these, as well as the drinking of an elixir which made Kelly drowsy. So this may have been opium or something like that. There's this other funny account where Kelly is trying to talk to somebody in a mirror, and he shows him an empty apothecary box and goes, "Look, my apothecary's box is empty." And the spirit is responding, and this is all through Kelly 2D, is responding, "Well, how do you expect me to give you anything information-wise when your apothecary box is empty? Don't you have any ointments?" And Kelly's like, "Nope, sorry." And I think what's happening here is, Kelly's like playing D a little bit to, fill up that apothecary box again so that the spirits will talk a little better, And, you got to remember, like, opium was very big in this time as well. We see this with Paracelsus. Paracelsus, it's thought his version of the Philosopher's Stone was actually opium. He's said to have kept some mouse-sized turd-sized bits of opium in the pommel of his sword. And I can imagine Paracelsus, if he was using a lot of opium, going through withdrawals and thinking, "Oh, I need some of my Philosopher's Stone," and then taking it, and then feeling better and going, I can feel the power of my Philosopher's Stone rejuvenating me, because they don't know about addiction and physical addiction and that sort of thing yet. And it's thought Paracelsus himself died of opium overdose, as well as Avicenna. And this is true of other figures from around this time period, right? He also had quintessence for epilepsy that contained cannabis. But in the case of Dee, I'm wondering if he may not have been prodding, he may not have been being prodding him to stock up on some of this material because of jonesing for it a little bit. But definitely, the spirit seemed to speak a little better when he used these substances. And it's interesting because the Royal Society, which is the foundation of our modern Western scientific world, was formed out of a lot of interest in this type of stuff. Ashmole, who was a big figure in the formation of the Royal Society, he was collecting Dee's writings and stuff like that. And Robert Hooke wrote an essay on ciphers in Dee's work, was very interested. He gave 2 lectures on cannabis at the Royal Society. And the term Indian hemp was actually developed because they were trying to figure out what the difference between the cannabis in India, which they were getting high off of, and the seemingly inert field hemp of Europe, right? And even Boyle, Robert Boyle, who founded it, is considered the father of modern chemistry. He wrote on the agenda that, they wanted to explore the Egyptian electuary, which is likely a reference to Majun or some other Mideast delicacy that contained hashish, Dawamask or something, and also the fungus referred to by the French author. He may be referring to Rabelais here, who had esoteric references to cannabis in his famous Gargantua Panegyril, but also makes reference to the good agaric mushroom in a way that may be indicating the fly agaric mushroom. And these were used for dreams and vision, according to Boyle, right? So they were trying to figure out what the root cause of these substances were. And this is giving us the modern, science. This is where science breaks off from alchemy and becomes this, modern thing that we know that is free of magic.
That's so interesting. So when you're talking about that, it's really showing that one thing that's happened with science is that loss of, I wouldn't even say just religion, because most people, they think of churches and what people do, but real religion, like religare, the term means to bind together. And, yoga actually means union. And so when you're talking about like the root of where a lot of our sciences come from, used to be about self-experimentation. It seems like, part of some of these plants, them being psychoactive.
The imperial method.
Right. Yeah. The
imperial method is using yourself as a study subject. Not just science, both magic and alchemy, they really come to the West with cannabis. Magic wise, we could talk about the Picatrix, which was the Latin translation of the 10th century Arabic word, the Gayat al-Hakim. And it's full of drugs. And it has a recipe in there for a hashish incense, a pound of cannabis resin mixed with stag blood in order to see the servant of the moon in a pillar of smoke. Much the same way Moses was using it in the tent of the meeting 10 centuries later. Also opium, mandrake, all this type of stuff in the Picatrix. And this is what really got Agrippa and Paracelsus and these figures going. Alchemy-wise, the nice thing about cannabis is there's actual archaeological and actual textual references to it. You can talk to people about mushrooms and some of these other things, and it's usually based on some sort of interpretation of image in a painting they think looks like a mushroom, or some thing where they're interpreting the symbolism. Like if you consider this symbolism to symbolize this, you don't have to do that with cannabis. When I'm talking about cannabis references in the Picatrix, I'm talking about Latin references to cannabis. Likewise in alchemy. And in alchemy, in spagyric alchemy, which is the alchemy of plants, cannabis is particularly important in what was referred to as quintessences and arcanums. And these are basically tinctures. What they do is they would get wine, they'd bury it, that would separate, they'd keep the clear water, dump out the dark water, bury the clear water again, repeat this 5 times, and then that final clear water, that would be the chemical heaven, which they would capture the soul of plants, the 5th essence, the quintessence. And so they would put plants into this, fairly purified alcohol product. And out of that, then they'd leave them in there for a while. They pull it out, repeat that a few times. And according to Paracelsus, you can increase the potency of plants like 20 tincturing process. And this was a major force in the whole alchemical world are cannabis and quintessences, and they were basically tinctures. And we know that cannabis was used in these because there's actual references to cannabis in these sorts of preparations in the work of, going all the way back to Zosimos in the 4th century A.D. Zosimos, who's kind of considered the father of Western alchemy, he refers to cannabis and darnel and other substances being put into beers and wines in Egypt for magical purposes, right? And then we see, when we get into the Middle East, we see Avicenna writing about these types of things in Jewish alchemical texts from the 13th century. Likewise, cannabis being used in arcanums as well as other psychoactive plants and medicinal plants. And then we get into Latin and European texts. We see the references to cannabis tinctures in the works of Cardano, in the Lullian corpus, and Rabelais called himself the master of the quintessence. And he had 3 chapters on cannabis. He incorporated esoterically into the herb Pantagruelian and made specific reference to its spiritual properties and stuff like that. So this was obviously something that was very real in alchemy and magic in this time period.
Yeah, so there's just something interesting about that, because as we're talking about, there were real shamanic origins with cannabis, and these real shamanic origins, it's just like any other shamanism for the most part that indulges in plants. There's so many things that's associated with it. So you've mentioned several things here, like the pairing of cannabis with ephedra. You've mentioned the infusing of cannabis into wine, into like a yogurt or a cream, like a lassi, like a cannabis milkshake. You've talked about infusing it into stag's blood, and in these ways, I often wonder, we kind of like science does, which is good. We separate things out so we can look at things independently. But, if you were to say, you take a mushroom, you take a mushroom, you're going to have the same experience. Like, no, you put it in a different setting, and you, especially a different matrix. Like you say, you're going to have cannabis. Like, okay, great. What, am I going to be at a concert? No, you're actually going to be inside a tent drinking it with stag's blood. Like, this is a whole different kind of way of consuming to me. And what's interesting to me is how this connects in all these other different cultures through different mediums. And I would love for you to touch upon if there's any other kinds of mediums that you talked about the anointing oil, the olive oil, cinnamon, cardamom, all that kind of stuff. But if there's a way that you could also tie it into Africa, we haven't talked about Africa, and I know there's a rich history there as well. So could you touch on that?
Well, the Pygmies, they say they burn cannabis, smoke it. It's thought that smoking cannabis in pipes and joints and that type of thing is actually something that came after tobacco smoking was discovered, and that even in Africa, that this came through Islamic traders that were going through the Congo and stuff like that, right? However, there is some challenges to that, and Nicholas Vandermeer, who I mentioned in relation to Shakespeare's pipes, he also studied pipes found in a cave in Ethiopia that were from the 14th century that contained cannabis resins, and this would put it pre-Columbian, right? So there may have been some sort of calabash type of smoking water pipe pre-Columbian in Africa. From these same sort of like pollen analyses and stuff like that, it's thought that cannabis didn't really make its way into Central Africa until much later, like medieval period, that sort of thing. There's debate about this type of stuff, right? You know what I mean? Things change too. New archaeological evidence. For many years, I was told there was no way that cannabis was in Israel, but now we know it was through archaeological evidence, right? But the Pygmies, they say that they've been smoking cannabis and using cannabis since the dawn of time, and that God gave them cannabis to be healthy and happy. Now, I think there's a possibility that the beginning of time may be a reference to the beginning of their concept of time. Because one of the things that cannabis does for first-time users is cause a shift in time perception. A minute seems like an hour seems like a minute. And you see this cross-culturally in references to cannabis. And so that shift in time perception causes an awareness of time itself, and there's some interesting like symbolism with time, like Father Time holds a scythe. The scythe is a tool used for harvesting cannabis. And St. Carl Sagan, he has speculated that maybe agriculture began with cannabis, and he used the pygmies as a specific example of this because they started cultivating plants when they began ritually using cannabis because they couldn't count on finding this particular herb out in the jungle, right? And so, that was one of the accusations that Anslinger was making against jazz musicians. By messing with time, they were slipping in extra beats where beats weren't supposed to be, And so there's this whole relationship with time in there, right? There's another Congo group called the Vienna Rambe, and that means the Sons of Hemp. And they were supposed to have been formed by this one chief. I think his name is Kalambuku, or I'm probably just bastardizing the pronunciation of the poor guy's name. But he had consolidated warring African tribes by getting them to burn their old tribal fetishes and becoming one group, the Sons of Hemp, and the ritual consumption of cannabis. And there's also an African queen who is said to have done a similar sort of consolidation through the ritual use of cannabis, And you can actually find Zulus as well, they were ritual users of cannabis, and they used it for battles and stuff like that. Going into war, and we see it with a couple of warrior cultures, the Nihang Sikhs and the Hashishin as well, right? Spiritual kind of warrior types. And so it definitely has been used and is still used. I've actually seen some really good anthropological videos of different African tribes still consuming cannabis on their way out to hunt. One of the ways that the pygmies use it, so a lot of times you're standing over a river spearfishing, and they kind of just get totally stoned, so they can just sit there like totally still for a while, and then bam, jab that fish. You know what I mean? And it seems to really facilitate that for them. And so, I think that, the natural kind of place for a lot of these substances is usually in some sort of initiatory ritual of allowing in the younger people into the adult circle, you know what I mean? And so then it's offered to them when that transition happens. There was even like a penalty where they would put you into a hot box type of thing and make so much cannabis smoke in there until you passed out. You know what I mean? And that was your punishment. Probably turned you off cannabis for a while after that.
Yeah, dude. Imagine. What's so funny is imagine if that was more of a common practice. Imagine if we just had rites of passage in our modern society nowadays. But when you look back, ibogaine, the ayahuasca, there's quite a few others, not all of them. Sometimes those plants were just consumed by the shaman themselves, but these were also rites of passage in certain groups. And so I kind of feel like with cannabis also being more accessible, right? Like to more people. Not everyone is going to go out and try like one of the most powerful psychedelics known to man. But, as far as cannabis, it seems a lot more accessible and can be just as powerful. But when you mention it like that, like how was that the Vienna Ramba? Was that them that you were talking about right there? Was that one of their rituals?
The punishment one, I think that was a pygmy thing, actually.
A pygmy, okay. Yeah, I find it interesting. Like, what if we had different ways of doing things, to include children, some kind of rite of passage, something to show other than here, keys to your car, here you can now, go serve in the military or drink alcohol. These things that really they're not healthy, and with driving, it can be fun, it can be fine, but you know what I mean? These aren't really, okay, you're a man now type of things. And throughout history, it was facing some kind of aspect of yourself to me, even in Brazil, when they would put their hands in these, gloves that had all these bullet ants in there, and they would be biting their hands, and that's part of the rite of passage. The biggest, yes, the pain is huge, but you have to have the courage, the moxie to go there and to do it. And I've even heard Native Americans today speaking about how they didn't have all-out war and thoughts of genocide and killing off neighboring tribes. They would have battles for sure, but the casualty rate wouldn't be ridiculously high. And a lot of their children, they would go and they would fight, and they would have fights. And it wasn't like today where the cops step in or the parents are like, no, you have to stop. They would let their children actually be a little bit more aggressive. And that actually, what a lot of them believe is, this is how we kept our children from turning into psychopaths, taking a gun into school. Obviously back then they didn't have that, but like things were more community led. There were elders looking after it as well. Today society's kind of broken that down. But I guess my overarching question and point here is, like, in today's world, I wonder how we could introduce cannabis more now that it's becoming like out of the closet a little bit more, how we could introduce it a little bit more, like in Half Baked, where you see in one room there's a dad smoking a joint thinking of how he can connect with his son, and in the next room over there's a kid smoking a bowl, just like, the all the rules of the house are, harsh and is mellow. And I'm just thinking, like, man, like, you're right, the solutions could potentially be all there. And for the most part, I'll just end with the whole Bill Hicks thing. Like, okay, you're at a ball game, two people bump into one another and they start a fight. Were they high or were they drunk? And everyone screams like they're drunk. And he's like, that's right, because it's physically impossible to have a fight with somebody if you're high. And what he was getting at there is, like, you don't even have the impulse or the drive. There's almost this resolution feeling that wants to happen. Like, okay, let's pass the joint around. Let's hash this thing out. There's something that I kind of feel in that, the healing of the nations, the bringing together of all the diversity and all the division, what was pushed out of the jazz clubs, what seemed to be pushed out of the religion. We went through Christianity and the, Asherah and the suppression and all this. I wonder how we can utilize this time period as something where it can return not just to something that, okay, it belongs in medicine, but that's it. Like, I almost feel like the religious aspect of it could have a little bit less, like, okay, let's not like worship idols and gods. That can be a part of it, but it doesn't have to be a part of it. How about we just get back to how we harmonize as a species?
Well, a few things I'm thinking about that is, there's been a lot of like warriors that have used cannabis. Bruce Lee loved hashish, was right into it and was very spiritual about his views on hashish. There's some great quotes from Bruce Lee about hashish. And, there's actual MMAR fights where cannabis is the prize, pound of, really good bud. And they'll sit down and they'll smoke before fighting, but it's not like a drunken fight. It's not a drunken brawl, man. You know what I mean? These are sportsmen and they take it. It's like a spiritual aspect, like a samurai or something like that, right? You know what I mean? And I think that's really becoming more and more pervasive in that scene due to people like Joe Rogan, for instance, and stuff, right? And their love of ganja, right? So we can't just, it is a peace bringer. And even in that world, it's kind of a peace bringer. You know what I mean? It's like, we're going to fight like brothers. You know what I mean? And I think that's kind of a natural thing. And I think you can go to, any sort of a medical cannabis dispensary and you'll find a community in that dispensary. This happens everywhere, everyone I've been into. There's a community of people there, caring individuals, man. And there's real love in those places and people from all walks of life coming in. And I think that, the big spiritual message is here. This is some sort of common origin of religions. This is, the tree of life whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. This is the return of Soma and Eoma. This is a return of cannabis, man. And this is like a powerful thing, man. When you start to take in the herb with that type of feeling, it changes it, like there's a big difference between, some kid sitting down smoking a blunt before playing some video games and some sadhu in India who's touching the chillum to his third eye in honor of Lord Shiva before sitting down to his yoga asanas. They're using the exact same material, but somehow because of the intent everything changes with it, you know? And I think that's one of the real powerful things that happens when you begin to understand the incredible, rich history of this plant, is that the plant itself begins to recloak itself with that mythology and history. And that starts to become part of what you're ingesting.
Yeah, man, you know, there's something really just beautiful about what you just said there. I actually saw on Instagram, it was, now these were, I think it was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because they were in gis, but it was in an octagon, it was modern, and it started with a scuffle, like the one had his puffing his chest out and chasing the other one, and then eventually enough, you know, refs got in the ring, they calmed it down, and here comes this beautiful big black man with a joint, and he's just here, and he gives it to the one guy takes it, and then you hear the crowd clapping like, yeah, and then he gives it to the other guy, he smokes, and then literally, and you can tell this wasn't staged, literally afterwards the guys go up and just pound fists again, like, all right, that's squashed, we're back in it. And you're right, they weren't just, it wasn't a drunken brawl, they were in their bodies, they were focused, they, you know, they had their limit, their tolerance, they could still perform their craft to a T, but they could do it with almost what Aikido wanted. Aikido, it wasn't about like breaking someone's jaw and looking great doing it, it was about the removal of harm. It was literally about neutralizing harm in any way. So if you could stop a fight without harm, that was it. If you could bring it back to the heart and harmonize the individuals, that's it. And that's what I saw. I was like, that joint, you know, they could have just gone on and smoked their own joints too, right? But they had to have somebody come in and be like, no, you both are going to share this same joint. You're going to hit it. The crowd is like, yeah, come on, enough. You know, I know tensions get high when you're competing. That's over. And it turned out to be a better moment that it happened than having it not happen at all. So yeah. I think that's a testament to that. Like, you know, I also get a lot of this, you know, if you're in sports, you got to be a meathead. You're probably dumb. I'm like, no, these are highly trained athletes. Let's not fault them for also, you know, having a temper off the court, or, you know, not driving so well, or, you know, needing some way to stress relieve, getting altered, and, you know, making a mistake that many of us could. These are highly trained athletes, and I'm kind of curious about cannabis moving forward in movement. I do a lot of different kinds of movement training, but what I'm seeing is in MMA, in other sports, there's people that are like, I remember Ronda Rousey was talking about Nick Diaz, and basically he had gotten suspended for having cannabis in his system, and Ronda Rousey came, you know, because she rolled with him, came to, you know, his aid and said, like, this is not you know, an athletic enhancement drug, you know, like the fact that he's done all the incredible athletic things that he's done with cannabis means he knows how to use it, and he knows how to fight hard to, you know, to keep himself in optimal health. So I think there's also this kind of like tainted view of cannabis that's lingering but being let go of post-prohibition.
Yeah, well, you know, not just like MAR, like, you know, you take sports like surfing and snowboarding and skateboarding. There's loads of potheads in those. I've been into surfing and skateboarding and gotten high very many times before surfing and skateboarding. And even now, I still go out for a rip. I usually, you know, get high before I go. And it can really help throw you in the zone. You know what I mean? Drop off everything else and get you right in there. So that's all that's happening for you. And I think that, you know, a lot of people self-medicate to get away from things like attention deficit disorder, because this plant does help you focus. It can help you focus. You know what I mean? Like, for some people, I think that it can also open up that trap door to the unconscious or subconscious and let out a lot of repressed thoughts. And that's why they get kind of uncomfortable with it. You know what I mean? But that also is part of the beauty of this plant, that it can do that. And that's probably a lot to do with its role in magic and things as well.
Yeah, that sounds to me like the intelligence of a plant, like you have to know how to use it intelligently, you know, so to really access it, because, I mean, as with any plant medicine, and I would put cannabis like, you know, smack dab in the middle of that. sometimes it gives you exactly what you want, and sometimes it doesn't. It gives you exactly what you need. And man, I saw this one image that was just like, at the top it said, everyone who has ever anyone who has any story about an edible ever, and it showed a normal kid, and then it says nothing, not high, still not high, still not high. And then the bottom one was just, how in a picture you can catch it at the wrong time and make somebody look like super baked. Like they did that, and it just said like, oh, S, bro. You know what I mean? It was just like, that's how, there's something about that, especially with edibles. And we didn't even touch on this, like edibles, when you eat hash, it turns into what is the, it's it goes from delta 9 THC to something else. Yeah. But anyway, it's made 4 times stronger as it passes through the liver. And so, and you'll just take a bit, you won't feel anything. And then all of a sudden, once you realize you're feeling something, that's usually when you're like, oh man, I should have stopped a while back.
Yeah. That's one of the things about its use in like magic and religion is like people weren't smoking it every day, casually. What we do is microdosing in a lot of senses compared to the way these people were taking it. A lot of times, like in the Zoroastrian infusions of cannabis, the wine infusions, they'd knock you out for a couple of days. You know what I mean? That's how potent they were. And so they're having a very different experience. They weren't like casual, regular users of cannabis. This was something that was used for a specific date and time by a specific person for a specific purpose, and much more intense than a casual smoking a joint or something like that.
Yeah, and anyone who's ever dabbled in cannabis or gone deep into cannabis for a while, you'll know that when tolerance builds up and then you give it a break for a little bit and then you come back to it, it almost seems like the original essence, like the creativity comes back. I noticed that when I was doing it, heavily, I could just do it. And part of that is probably the awareness that you bring into it, because I didn't always have to step away from it and then step back to have creativity come from it. But that seemed to be the way. Like when you're doing it more chronically, you're not bringing as much attention to it. And then you take it away, and when you do it again, it hits you in that original way. And it is interesting thinking that in the old world, when it was a bit more scarce, like you said, these people who would go into, let's say, spoken word or whatever it was that they were doing, that wasn't something that was happening every evening. It wasn't just like well, it's Friday, might as well, pull out the bong, whatever it is. They would do higher doses, and they would get into a state that people witnessing around probably were like, man, like he just got lyrical all of a sudden. What happened to this cat over here? So I think that's a really interesting thing about this plant, and that really points out some ways that we could potentially use it differently moving forward. I guess I kind of feel what I'm excited about, and I guess this is really just like the pinnacle of what I wanted to ask you since the beginning. We talked a little bit about the religious use, but do you have some kind of advice for somebody who, whether they've used cannabis in the past and they want a new relationship with it, they don't necessarily just want to give it up, they want a new relationship with it, and they definitely want to go down a more spiritual or sacred pathway with this plant rather than a casual, like you were saying, the kid eating junk food, smoking a blunt, and then playing video games. How can you use the same plant today in today's world? What would you suggest as far as the quality of the plant? And maybe just give us a little guidance on what could craft the whole experience in a little bit more sacred of a light.
Well, gadget yoga is a huge thing happening right now. There's all sorts of people are practicing yoga and using cannabis, and this is something that people have done for centuries. You know what I mean? Shiva's both the Lord of cannabis and Lord of yoga, right? So it's a pretty clear connection. That's probably the most accessible type of thing. I think, like for myself, it's like my relationship with cannabis is like everything that I do for it's kind of like in honor of it. You know what I mean? My whole life has been kind of tied up with this herb. So I use it a lot. You know what I mean? I smoke like a rasta. I usually vaporize cannabis. I use a volcano vaporizer. Is mostly the way that I do it. I think you want to kind of look at things like harm reduction a little bit if you're going to be a user of cannabis, and look at the best ways to use it. I find myself, if I'm smoking joints all the time, I'll get a hack and a cough, and I don't experience that with vaporizers, and my lungs are always clean, and I don't get colds and things like that. So I think that's important. But I think the intention is where your mind is at when you're using it. You know what I mean? If you're feeling like you need to ritualize it, well, you could do something like ritualize it around doing a session of yoga or meditation or something like that. But to a lot of people, it's more like you're talking about creativity. You know what I mean? And I think that that's a fuel for a lot of musicians and artists. Alex Gray, you know, he's definitely puffing a lot of cannabis when he's doing his paintings. And I know other artists that are similar to that. And music-wise, can be clearer there. You know what I mean? There's so much cannabis in music culture, and that's always been that way. There's like, you know, forms of Greek jazz from the 20s and 30s, Rambigiata, that have all sorts of hashish songs, and then the jazz here, and then rock and roll and reggae, and you know, all these different types of variety hip hop that are directly linked up with that kind of aspect of it. You know, I think magic is another way, another interface for cannabis that's really interesting, and also initiatory ritual such as those by the Freemasons and things like that could be potentially enhanced by the addition of cannabis. And, you know, one of the things I think, you know, when I was really trying to understand what the significance was of cannabis and magic, and I think it's interrelated with cannabis's relationship with dreaming. Cannabis has a very interesting relationship with dreaming. People that use a lot of cannabis, they report dreaming very little. And this is why people with PTSD often like cannabis, because actually it'll suppress bad dreams and stuff like that, right? And when I was researching cannabis, read in books on melatonin about cannabis having a very powerful effect on melatonin levels. And they did studies in the 80s. Unfortunately, these haven't been repeated. They need to be repeated. But they did studies in the 80s, and they found that people using cannabis could spike their daytime levels of melatonin as much as 2,000 times regular daytime levels, right? And so my thought is that this is likely depleting melatonin for nighttime, so you're not dreaming as much as at night. But I've noticed an alternative effect. A couple of times I'd gotten up at about 4 a.m, couldn't sleep, smoke a bowl, go back to bed, and have the most intense, vivid, interactive dreams I've ever had. And I'm attributing this to the same spike of melatonin that was taking place. And I think, you know, one of the places we really see cannabis used a lot is with magic mirrors. And this isn't just in the 16th century. In the 19th century, there's a whole scene happening with magic mirrors and hashish, with figures like Dr. Pascal Beverly Randolph, a black African-American who was an importer of hashish in the 1850s, 1860s, and was the first Rosicrucian American Grand Master. But he was really into cannabis and magic mirrors, and there's a whole scene in France that he got this from Louis Alphonse Cagné and other Rosicrucian figures and stuff in France that were using it for the same purpose. I read about this in Liber 420. And my view is that this use of cannabis is directed at this same sort of spike in melatonin, and that what they're communicating with in the mirror is the same thing that's telling us our dreams at night. When we dream at night, we're in the dream, but we're also being told the dream, and we're all the other characters in the dream. It's all happening inside our heads. And this interaction is the unconscious or subconscious. And the actual definition of the unconscious and the subconscious really started to take place when they started looking at cannabis. Dr. J.J. Moreau, who was a member of Le Club de Hachishines, the France's hashish club in the 1850s that had people in it like Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Théophile Gautier, Gerard de Nerval, Honoré de Balzac, whose writings are still read today many wrote about their experiences with hashish as well. He was actually interested in it because he thought what it was doing was mimicking insanity and dream states. And this is where we start to see this idea of an unconscious or subconscious, this other self that can interact with our present self. And in a sense, this is what we could refer to as the sun and the moon. The sun is our daytime aware consciousness, and the moon is that silver poetic nature, right, that comes out at night and gives us all this symbolism in our dreams and interacts and is what's speaking through people when they get in that trance state as well, right? And what genius is when you bring those two things together, that daytime conscious and that nighttime consciousness, and you marriage that sun and that moon in the individual, man. That's that's what this is all about, man. And things like magic and alchemy, they're potential interfaces for achieving that end, right? And same with yoga.
It's incredible that there's a plant so versatile, and we haven't even touched on. Any of the listeners can, go if they don't know and just research all the medicinal sides of it, the rest of the industrial sides, all the different uses from this one plant. But everything that you were just mentioning right there, the access to the subconscious or the unconscious, the access to different aspects of ourselves using a plant. And this one plant, I definitely feel like if there is a tree of life motif that has some kind of literal in the 3D embodiment, cannabis seems to really hold that as far across the globe as you can find. All of its influence, all of its ability to, the magic plant and several other things on Psychedelica that I've done that really just kind of broke down not just the history, but all the different uses of it, all the different ways. Going back into ancient Assyria with epilepsy, I could go on. But the bottom line is there's this plant that seems to help. It's the helper with all these different things. Like, oh, you need cheap graphene. It's way too expensive and it's too polluting. You can graphenize hemp. Like, oh, you need medicine for this, for that. Your endocannabinoid system out of whack, which could cause any number of things. Here's this one plant. You need concrete that'll stand the test of time. Man, it's just over and over again, all coming back to this plant. And I just have to say, I really appreciate that you've dedicated. It's just so unique to me. It's so obvious, the branding of your writing all centered around a plant, but your writing has gotten me deeper into history, into the origins of religions. You showed me things from parts of the world I didn't even know how to pronounce. I love all of that. And I think that you just posted something, or Graham Hancock just reposted an article of yours. Is that correct?
I've got a couple things on Hancock's site. I did a thing on Arad, Jerusalem, the archaeology out of there, and he also did an overview of Liber 420. Right now, we're talking about having a sort of like a paper competition around Soma, because there's a lot of different claims about it being the Amanita muscaria or Syrian rue, harmaline, various ayahuasca analogs and things like that, right? And so we're trying to bring everybody together to compare notes and, see what stands the test, right? You know what I mean? And that, again, is where I really like cannabis and being involved with cannabis, because you're left to a lot less speculation, and there's this hard archaeology coming out to make the cases with. And I don't think that makes any of these other substances any less sacred. And I think, even like Soma became kind of like a generic term for plant medicines. And I think that cannabis is leading the way for a lot of plant medicines. Like, for instance, here in Canada, we legalized a couple of years ago. And now on the very road I live in, there's a factory legally growing medical magic mushrooms. And that's how fast things have been pushed into gear here in Canada by the legalization of cannabis, right? You know what I mean? And I think the real thing here is that these plants are, in a sense, messengers of Gaia, messengers of Mother Earth at this pivotal time for humanity where we're, crushing our mother to death, with what we're doing to the planet, and offering us a way to get back in there. And I think that that's a real big difference between us and some of the cultures that continued use of these substances. You know, we got separated from Eden, and nature became a commodity that was free for our exploitation. Didn't become our home and our sacred environment. You know what I mean? But cultures that maintained a relationship with these plants, used them in cultural initiations into adulthood. You know, these people, they experience the jungles and the forest as living entities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, part of their family, man. And I think that right now, that's the message of these plants, is like, this is how we get back into Eden, you know, and how we get back into this natural relationship and in harmony with Mother Earth, and start being the consciousness of the earth, and instead of battling with our minds against it.
Yeah, man, dude, I couldn't agree with you more. And I feel that, you know, the thing about cannabis, I love seeing it beginning its proper placement back in a shamanic pantheon, because for so long there are all these very sexy, seductive plants, you know, ibogaine, you got the mushroom, you got the vine, and then there's cannabis, and people's historical memory of cannabis seems only to go back to the 70s in most part, you know, 60s and 70s. And there's such a rich history that you bring to bear with all of your research. I want to make sure that everyone knows exactly where to find you and how they can best support you and get their hands on all this incredible info that you have.
I'm probably like most active on Facebook. I'm at the 5,000 limit, but you can follow me, and most of my posts are public, so you can comment and that type of stuff. And I have a blog over at cannabisculture.com, where I'm always posting historical information and any, I really keep an eye on any sort of new history or new archaeology coming out, so you can count on being kept aware of that. I've also got an Instagram account and a YouTube account. I don't use those as much. I do have some documentaries on YouTube about cannabosum, about cannabis and agent grease, or Mithraism, that have great interviews with people like Professor Carl Ruck and Dr. David Hillman and Dr. Ethan Russo. And you can find those by searching my name in cannabis on YouTube. Also, a lot of articles and stuff you can find on Google just by searching my name and cannabis. But I guess if you really want to keep up to date, follow me on Facebook, and that's where I'm really most active these days. I am giving a talk for Oklahoma State University on April 20th, and that will be, they have Oklahoma State TV at Oklahoma State University that will be live streamed and archived there. And that will be for the religious studies department, and I'll be focusing on the archaeology and evidence for both Soma and cannabosum, so kind of a more detailed account of what we've been discussing there. And there's opportunity to ask questions and stuff like that if you sign up for it.
And that's on 420?
That's on 420.
Okay. What day of the week is that?
Oh, man. I have to look at a calendar.
We're on the 15th now, so that's got to be like Monday or something like that. I just want to make sure people don't forget that.
I've got
20th is Tuesday. Okay, the 20th is a Tuesday. So 420 Oklahoma City. Okay, and that flyer is on your website? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I can tell you you just go to Oklahoma University, you'll be able to find it.
And we'll be able to put something in the show notes as well. I think
Cool.
I think that's incredible. I want people to be able to get a hold of all of your info. Like I said, this guy's books, man, take your time with it. There's a lot in there. It will rewrite history for a lot of you out there. I'm really excited that we could have you on the show. I wanna part with something a little bit more philosophical and just really succinct. What if you could make like one impact, if you had to just bring it down to like one real impact that you would like to leave this world with, what would that be? How would you sum that up?
Oh man, I guess like my big goal has just been establishing this religious history of cannabis and bringing that message. It's been a purpose ever since I had that religious experience. It was kind of like, the Grail vision of Parsifal in a way, and bring this message to mankind. And I feel like I'm almost there. You know, almost mainstream, man. You know, it's getting real close.
Yeah, man. I would say like you've done it because there's an inner circle of real studiers. Everyone from Lex Pelger to, you know, other researchers that I've interviewed, they all say like, and have you heard of Chris Bennett? You got to read his books. And I was already hot on the trail, as you see with, you know, Cannabis and the Soma Solution. I just have all these tabs and there's all these things, and all those tabs are like on the same thing on your computer. When you leave 100 tabs open of like, I got to research that, then that. So you've done it, man. You opened up Pandora's box inside me, and I have to thank you for that, because that's just such a good, inspiring feeling. So I appreciate all the work you're doing.
Your work's bringing it out to so many people, Ben. You know what I mean? Psychedelic. It's this type of stuff that delivers these type of messages into mainstream audiences. You got to like simplify. My books are very detailed, and I think you know, it's kind of what I had to do to make the information stick, but it's harder for the information to sink in when you go into that type of referencing in detail. And I think that it's the, you know, when you can break it down into a video presentation and something that people can get a hold of in 5, 10, 15 minutes, that's when you really start seeing the mass effect.
Yeah.
But you know, that stuff doesn't hold up unless you have the foundation of solid research that's behind it. You know what I mean? It starts to fall apart. And I think a lot of books on psychedelics in history really start to fall apart because they don't really have that solid of a foundation. And what I've really tried to do is build a house that stands for generations.
Yeah, man. Well, you've done it. We've talked in the past. We've floated the idea back and forth where you're asking me like, dude, drugs in history. This is a film right here. And yeah, you're definitely right, you know, and specifically, you know, I feel it coming. I feel it coming, like me and you collaborating on something, just because you're right.
Yeah, a biblical accounting that goes into, we didn't even really get into the whole Christian Gnostic use of cannabis. And that's like a fascinating story right there. But I think, you know, just stuff on, and there's, you know, the Arad find isn't the only find in Israel. There's Bet Shemesh in the 4th century AD, where cannabis was used topically and as an incense, as a medical use for a girl who was giving birth and died during childbirth. They'd been burning cannabis and placing cannabis ointments on her belly. And so this is like a 1,200-year stretch in the Holy Land of cannabis between these two archaeological finds. And there's a lot to explore there. And I think that for us in the West, that's the real revelation, is this biblical stuff. For people over in you know, the Middle East and India, I think, you know, we've got to take a look at Soma and Helma, and also this incredible history in Islam with cannabis, because it's got a pretty wild history there as well.
For sure. I say we got to do a part 2 of this, because there still is a lot of history that we haven't even touched upon. It's super rich. None of it is boring. All of it really does rewrite the idea of history in your mind. So we got to do this again, man. Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining on. This has been a really, really amazing podcast. I know that the audience is getting a lot out of it, and we'll have to bring you back, man. Thank you so much for your time.
Take care,
thank you, Chris.
Brother. All the best, man. Boom, boom. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yep.
Still be here without you.